This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hello there, and welcome to the Bryan Hyde Show. I'm joined by Eric Peters from Eric Peters Autos. We have a chance every Tuesday to sit down and discuss what's happening, and I guess what's happening is independence, allegedly.
Well, you almost never hear that word talked about anymore, do you? It's always the 4th of July, and we hear vague talk about our freedoms, which is kind of an odd thing. It's never really specifically laid out what exactly our freedoms are, never mind how little freedom we actually have. I like the word independence because it does kind of get to the heart of the matter, which was that the American colonies asserted their independence from the state of Great Britain. There's something implicit in that, of course, that's incandescently dangerous to the current order. This idea of asserting your independence, of refusing to be governed except perhaps by your consent. And then that consent only applies to yourself, not to other people. You can't give consent on behalf of other people who haven't given it. That's, I think, the thing that we might contemplate now. Obviously, it's going to be difficult for us to physically separate ourselves from the state, but we can withdraw our consent right here in our minds and say to ourselves, what is this business? Why is it that I'm not bothering anybody. I'm a responsible person. I'm paying my bills. I'm taking care of myself and my family. I really ought to not have to deal with this entity called the state. And yet the state is constantly in our lives, extracting money from us, pestering us over things that are not properly any of the state's business. It's ironic, that here we are about to celebrate our freedom when most people aren't even free to drive their own car without wearing a seatbelt. It would be funny if it weren't so tragic.
Yeah, I agree with your premise too, that most people don't look beyond the surface of, yay, time off and fireworks. Well, maybe, I don't know. There's a lot of the country that's burning up right now, especially out west. But the holidays are kind of like a pressure relief valve, in that if we start feeling like things are getting a little bit oppressive, oh, look, now we've got a few days to kind of blow some steam off, and then it's right back into our cage, right back into whatever we were doing before. And, the context in which independence was declared doesn't seem to get a whole lot of discussion, does it?
Yeah, that's well said. It's sort of like what I like the term sports ball. It's like a catch-all for anything having to do with professional paid entertainment. The NFL, NHL, soccer, all of that stuff. You're right. It's a pressure relief valve. It gives frustrated people an opportunity to yell and scream and do so in a way that's utterly harmless to the state. In 1984, Orwell talked about it. It was the 2 minutes hate. You can't change the fact that people are going to get irritated when they're oppressed. So you have to figure out a way to release the tension. So in 1984, people were allowed to scream and throw cans at the picture of Big Brother. We scream for our team. We get drunk on the 4th of July and maybe light off a few pathetic fireworks that don't fly because we're not allowed to have things that fly or explode. We have these sad little cones. Oh, look at sparkles. Ah. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Well, and I look at some of those who participated in the actual Declaration of Independence, some of the signers, John Adams particularly comes to mind. It wasn't like they were saying, look, this should be a very somber and reverent holiday, but they definitely did say that this isn't just about, the fireworks and the cannon shots and celebration. They also, they approached it with some soberness in the sense that independence was not something that came easily. There were a lot of people lost their fortunes, lost their lives, lost family members in the course of breaking away from Great Britain because the king was not about to let them go freely.
Sure. And we had the second example of the second attempt to assert independence by the southern states on April the 17th, 1861. Very few Americans know that date. That was the date when Virginia and a number of other states declared their independence from the Union, very much like the colonies declared their independence from union with the state of Great Britain. They wanted to depart. They wanted to secede. Unfortunately, they weren't successful. The Union armies under Abe Lincoln brought them to heel and asserted the primacy of the federal government and said, if you leave, we will kill you, basically. I mean, it literally is the thing we've all seen on that old Cops TV show where, the guy's beating the hell out of his wife because she wants to leave. That's essentially it. It's a forced union. It's not voluntary. That's the viciousness of it. We're taught to revere the union, which would be fine if it were like a happy marriage. That's great. Your mom and dad have been married for 60 years. They love each other. They want to be together. That's great. But if it turns out that unfortunately your father was a jerk and was beating your mother for the past 60 years, that's not a union you want to celebrate.
Someone once said you could pretty much summarize people into one of two groups: those who are okay to leave others alone to pursue happiness as they wish, and those who just have to try to control others, through some kind of outside force. And sadly, there are a lot of Republicans that buy into that. It's not just the Democrats that are, trying to control your life. There are Republicans, particularly those who venerate Lincoln, as the great liberator. I know slavery is kind of the catchphrase. Well, the South had slavery, but in reality, what Lincoln accomplished through that war of forced association was chattel slavery was done away with. It was already on its way out thanks to, industrialization, but he pretty much converted everybody into slaves of a central government and with no recourse, no way to get away.
That's very well said. And I like what you said about the Republicans in particular, because ostensibly the Republican Party is the party of freedom. I get exasperated sometimes having conversations with some of my conservative friends who claim they don't like the state. They object to things like the income tax, for example. I've got a friend of mine I talk about this with often. He just moans about the income tax, and I'm with him on that. But then he's all for the property tax because he says that funds local government, the schools and the cops, which he likes. And I try to say to him, well, you've just completely undermined and undercut any moral case you might have made for not having an income tax. If the state, regardless of what level it is entitled to take a portion of your money to finance something that it or other people think deserves to be funded, you've given up the game. That's why Republicans lose. That's why, I don't know if you remember the writer Sam Francis, he coined the term the stupid party, in reference to the GOP, which it is, but it's also, I think, and frankly, the evil party, because it's not honest. I will give the left this. The left is honest about what its aims are. It does like the state. It wants the state to run everything. So at least you know what you're getting. But there's something really aggravating to me about hearing these Republicans talk about freedom while Lee Greenwood plays in the background and the flags are fluttering and waving. All they're saying is that we're all for the state. We just want the state to do the things that we like the state to do. We don't want the money going to the LGBT people. We want it going to the cops. We want it going to Raytheon and Boeing and all these other things.
It seems like there's an opportunity here for people to really take a closer look at that word secession. I know it's kind of a hiss and byword because, well, the South tried it, but that's exactly what the colonies did. They seceded as little republics away from Great Britain, and that's what we celebrate. And I guess the point I'm asking people to consider is, even if it's not a big political secession, done officially at, the top levels, you can still personally secede from the people or influences that are, either filled with bad ideas or simply trying to control your life in ways that you don't agree with. And that's something that I think needs some more exploration.
I agree. Let's snatch back that word. It shouldn't be a dirty word. As you say, people often, you hear the word secession and it's almost like, that's just an awful thing without any examination of it. And yet in everyday life, we all practice secession, don't we? We elect to secede from people that I don't particularly want to do business with that person. I don't particularly want to live here. I'd rather live over there. So many ways we practice secession on the individual level. Nothing wrong with it. It's entirely moral. The tragedy is that, the right to free association, which is ultimately what secession is all about, has been eviscerated since the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And similarly to the way secession has been demonized, free association has been connected with this idea of racism. Like you're bad, you're wanting to, not do business with people because they happen to be black or Asian or whatever it is. And there's kind of a superficial element of truth to that, but it masks and covers up the much more important underlying reality, which is how important it is to be able to freely associate. That gives a vent. A good example of this is, if we were thinking about COVID, and if a store owner had the right to freely associate, he could keep his doors open. You're not forced to go in. You can go in if you want to. Nobody's saying you have to go in. And the guy across the street, maybe he wants to close his doors and he has the right to do that. What is wrong with that? What is wrong with letting people interact, voluntarily in all these many ways without this top-down, one-size-fits-all idea and forcing everybody to be together in a way that's really pernicious. No wonder there's so much tension and stress. No wonder everybody's angry. Imagine if you were forced to share your house with somebody that you just did not get along with, that you didn't want to be in any proximity to. Would you be a happy guy? Obviously you wouldn't be.
No, forced association is what begets that tension and resentment. And that's where a lot of the fractures come from. By the way, if you want to look at a good example of secession, personal secession, people who homeschool their kids, they have removed themselves from a government-run school system. And I know immediately some people, well, they're just doing that for cheap labor or so their kids can play. No, one thing you'll notice about the kids who are homeschooled, they're not brought up being trained to hate their country. Whereas the kids in public school, isn't there like the obligatory struggle sessions where we have to address the guilt for everything that's done? Let's give an acknowledgement for the land that we sit on and so forth.
On a personal level, I know a number of homeschooled kids. They're my circle of people who do homeschooling. And I find it remarkable that in every single case, and I know a lot of them, these kids are thoughtful kids, way beyond their years. It's really interesting. You can have adult conversations with, 11 and 12-year-olds. And meanwhile, a lot of the kids who go to government schools, they're like in this state of perpetual adolescence, and they can't communicate. They can't articulate a thought. Even in college, they're just emoting. They've been stifled. They've been crippled and gimped in a way by the government schools. And that's deliberate. And anybody who thinks that I'm being a little bit off the reservation there, I recommend that they read John Taylor Gatto's work about what goes on in the government schools.
Yeah, you segregate kids by age and convince them now you can't talk to people who are in this group above you or this group below you. You have to stick with your own group. We homeschooled our kids for a period, especially my older kids. And that was a comment that I would get often from different people that we would be visiting with, was they'd say, I can't believe how comfortable your kids are in talking with adults and just, they're bright kids. And this is not to say that every one of them was a genius with 160 IQ. They all had different abilities, but taking them out of that forced segregation of, you can only interact with your peers and you can't get too far ahead of them or else, that's a disruption to the class. It was really neat to hear people say, I love that I had a chance to visit with your kid and your kid wasn't intimidated by it at all.
It's remarkable. I remember the first time I came across letters that were written by teenagers in the Civil War, some of whom were actually serving in both the Union and the Confederate armies. And, these were 14, 15-year-olds. And they were articulating thoughts in the manner of a grown man. Really impressive. And it's not that they were geniuses. It's that they learned how to think. This used to be what the purpose of an education was. It was to teach you how to think. The rest is incidental. The rest is the accumulation of information, which your mind, your thinking brain can then distill into useful understanding of the world, where it's been completely inverted. Now it's all about imposing authority, reflexive obedience to what you were told, rote memorization of random facts with nothing that brings it all together conceptually. That's deliberate. That's on purpose. They want machine minders. They want what George Carlin called obedient workers, and it's worked.
Yep. And I guess this is why you and I do what we do. It's not so much we're trying to educate all the children, to think for themselves. Although I have to tell you, for Father's Day, a friend of mine, his kids were reflecting on certain memories that they had with their dad. And he said, hey, I just had to share this with you because you made the cut. And one of his kids had said, I remember when you would be taking us to football practice or whatever, and we'd all be listening to the Bryan Hyde show. And I was like, oh, man. I can't tell you how that touched my heart to hear that.
Yeah. The segregation of ages, and it's not just kids, it's also old people who get shunted off into, these care homes and everything. So you're stuck with your generational cohort. And you're not supposed to interact with, people who are outside of your cohort on either side, the young or the old. It's a horrible thing. It's destructive of families, of communities, and ultimately of the nation, I think.
Well, I would encourage anyone within earshot, please have fun. this year for Independence Day. But, if you really want to make it meaningful, it might be time to find a quiet place, preferably away from electronic devices, and just ask yourself, have a little contemplation about what exactly am I celebrating and what exactly is independence, to me. I'm not looking for any right answer, but
how about sitting down and actually getting the Declaration of Independence and reading it, and especially the list of grievances against the government of the King of England at the time. That's quite revelatory. We hear about the preamble all the time because of its lofty language, but you get into the nitty gritty of the Declaration and you understand why they wanted to secede.
Very much so. I've told you this. I'll remind those who haven't heard. I was commissioned a little over a year ago to write an ongoing series about the signers of the Declaration of Independence for a local paper here in southern Idaho. And it's been fun because I have been able to delve into the actual personal lives of these individuals. And, if you think, well, they were all rich white men who owned slaves, not even close. I mean, they all had influence in some way, shape, or form, but very different backgrounds. Some of them were quite loyal to the crown starting out and eventually came around to the idea of, we need our independence. But it's fascinating to see the degree of moral clarity that they all had. Because what they were doing was not something light. This was not some prank of, I'll sign my name, and the king's going to really get upset about this. Yeah, he was going to get upset, and he was going to send people to take you and hang you until you were dead if you were caught. So, I mean,
very serious business, very serious business. And as you say, the people who were key players in that were incredibly thoughtful people. They would at length elaborate their reasoning in a way that just is extremely uncommon today. We live in this cycle of immediacy where everything's a soundbite or a tweet. They would compose these lengthy letters to each other, outlining their position, their view on something. It was a wonderful period to think, the value that they placed on reason, on thinking, on persuading, as opposed to just stomping their hooves and yelling at each other.
Right? Yeah, I know some people think, well, the language is just too far above my head. It doesn't have to be. There's a simple matter of sitting down and reading, and if you come to a word you don't quite understand, take a minute and look it up. It's never been easier. You don't have to break out a dictionary. It's right there in your hand. Just look up the word, see what it means, and move on. But I don't see a renaissance regarding freedom, especially personal freedom, taking place until people are willing to assume that responsibility and stop waiting for some, blow-dried spinmeister to give them, the pre-digested talking points they need to be parroting.
One of the reasons that I like what Jefferson did is that his prose was lucid. You do not have to be a scholar to understand what he was trying to convey. And the same with John Adams or Tom Paine, very, very conversational language, dealing with difficult topics and conveying complex ideas in a way that's manageable and understandable. Common Sense was written for the ordinary American. It wasn't something that was passed along among college professors at the time. It was sold in pubs. It was handed out to yeoman farmers. It was directed at just Joe Everyman, and Joe Everyman read it and understood it. These are not particularly difficult. Good writing is not hard writing, I find. Good writing is understandable writing. If it's difficult to understand, it's not good writing.
Hear, hear. We're down to the last couple minutes of the segment here, but I'd sure love to talk cars with you. And if there's a way to relate this to independence, we can do that. But most importantly, I've got to know what have you been test driving lately? What stands out to you, either good or bad?
Well, it's one of the sort of last of its line. I've got a Mazda CX-30, which is a small crossover this week. And it's new, but it's old. It hasn't been updated since about 2020, which is a good thing if you don't want a humongous touchscreen in your car. If you like actual gauges, dials and needles. And if you don't want that creepy eye monitor system that's coming online next year. Very nice little car that's like cars used to be to a great extent. I'm a huge fan of it for that reason. I would like it if they still offered it with a manual transmission, but you can't have everything.
So what is it? I got to ask you this mainly because my son owns a Mazda. How does Mazda stack up in terms of holding up? I mean, Toyota kind of has legendary status. Honda's up there too. Where does Mazda fit into that hierarchy?
Well, not only really well, but better now, because this Mazda, for example, has an engine that's appropriately sized, 2.5 liters. It doesn't have a little 1.5 liter engine, so it doesn't need a turbo, so it's not under pressure. So it's probably going to live a longer life than the highly pressurized, undersized engines that you find in other competitor models in the segment. It also still has a 6-speed automatic, a conventional automatic transmission, not a CVT. CVTs are problematic. They are just inherently more fragile than conventional automatics. Toyota and Honda have gone all in on CVTs because you get a slight increase in gas mileage, which has to do with regulatory compliance. That's the only reason they're doing it. It's not because the CVT performs better than the conventional automatic. It's just a fractional advantage in getting uncle off their back. So yeah, that aspect of it, and the fact that it's generally simpler, it doesn't have the big touch screen. I mean, people are all in on these touch screens, and I asked them, how much mileage do you get out of your smartphone? Would do you think you're going to be, whatever phone you have right now, do you think you're going to be carrying that thing around 8 years from now? Probably not. It's going to be obsolete. It's a throwaway. Well, you're buying a car that has this embedded, massive, basically smartphone in it that is going to be superseded so quickly and so dated very quickly. And then what? What are you going to do with it? 5-6 years from now, when it's just an obsolete thing, it's like almost like having an 8-track tape player in a brand new car.
Wow, that's well said, and I agree. Give me knobs and something that I can actually use to adjust the air conditioning or the radio or whatever the case may be. I'm really coming around to this point, Eric, where a friend sent me somebody was selling a nice Mercury Marquis from, I think it was 2010 with about 50,000 miles on it. And I was like, oh.
You're going to get it?
No. I would like to. Unfortunately, there's some other things that are taking priority, but it's the idea of
Idaho and buy the thing myself.
Yeah, this one's actually in southern Utah. So, hey, if it's still out there, somebody should snap it up. Wow. But it's the idea of something you can work on yourself and something that's built to last. I like new cars, but not enough to want to, get all the other extras that come along, the automatic stop start and so forth. Nah, yeah. No, thank you.
Yeah, particularly this, I try to publicize this as much as possible, this drowsy/distracted driver mandate that goes into effect in 2027 that has effectively made the manufacturers install these infrared cameras, these eye movement monitors. So you're being watched literally every moment while you drive by the car. I don't want that. I don't care how appealing a car is otherwise. I'm not interested in being surveilled by my car as I drive.
Yep. We got enough Big Brother in our lives. We don't need it taken to the road with us, right?
Final thought. So just say no, secede from that. And in fact, do it in a way that conveys the message. If you do business with a car dealer and you've been buying vehicles from the same guy for the last 20 or 30 years, tell him, hey, I'd love to buy another car from you, but I'm not interested in this technology. I don't want it. I will not have anything to do with it. So until you can sell me a car that doesn't have it, I won't be buying a new car anymore.
Hear, hear. Nice way to tie it into independence, too. On that note, we will call it an episode. Again, my guest is Eric Peters from Eric Peters Autos. I'll include links to his website in the show notes. Eric, thanks once again. Happy Independence Day, and we'll talk next week.
Right back at you. Thank you, Bryan.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.